The car seat buckle jammed again on the third try, the way it always did in -15 weather, and Mila was already crying. That thin, reedy cry that meant she was past fussy and into something worse. I got it on the fourth try. My fingers had gone numb somewhere between the parking garage and the street, and I hadn't bothered with gloves because I'd thought we were just running to the pharmacy. That's what I'd told myself at 4 in the afternoon. Just the pharmacy. Just infant, Tylenol, and maybe some of those saline drops that sometimes helped when her nose got like this. That was 3 hours ago. Now it was past 7, and we were still in the Sobeys parking lot on Carling Avenue, and my daughter was burning up in her car seat, and I couldn't get the buckle closed. 8 months old. 8 months and 2 weeks, if you counted the way I always counted, the way mothers count everything when they're doing it alone. She'd started pulling herself up on the edge of her crib last Tuesday, grabbing the wooden rail with both fists, like she was furious at gravity. Dark hair, same as her father's. Eyes still that murky newborn blue that everyone says will change, except they hadn't changed yet. And sometimes in certain light, she looked so much like him I had to look away. 17 months since the divorce. 17 months since I'd signed the papers in a lawyer's office on Bank Street and driven myself home in the snow because there was no one left to call. I got the buckle on the 5th try. The Tylenol wasn't working. I'd given it to her before we left the apartment, measured it out carefully with the little syringe, held her against my shoulder, held her against Alhashawa, and spat half of it back onto my jacket. That jacket was still damp. I could feel it against my collarbone. The thermometer had read 38.9 when we left. I'd told myself that wasn't so bad. I'd told myself a lot of things. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. My friend Petra. She'd been texting since this morning, checking in because I'd mentioned at our last call that Mila seemed off. More clingy than usual. Not eating well. I'd said it the way you say things when you don't want to alarm anyone, including yourself. I ignored the message and pulled out of the parking lot. Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario was 20 minutes away in good traffic. Ottawa in November is not good traffic. I took the 417 anyway because surface streets had construction and I couldn't think clearly enough to navigate around it. Mila had gone quiet in the back seat. That was the thing that scared me. Not the crying, the quiet after. I kept checking the rearview mirror, kept seeing the back of her car seat, the little stuffed elephant clipped to the handle, the way her head lolled slightly to one side. She was breathing. I could see her chest. I just needed to keep seeing her chest. Chio's emergency entrance glowed orange through the windshield. I pulled up to the drop-off and a nurse was already coming out. Whether for another patient or for us, I couldn't tell. But she saw my face through the glass and came straight to my door. "My daughter," I said, and my voice didn't sound like my voice. "She has a fever, and she's not responding the way she should." They took us in immediately. Not the waiting room. Through the doors, into the back, into the bright lights. And the smell of antiseptic, and the sounds of other parents in other small rooms doing the same thing I was doing, which was trying not to fall apart. A doctor came in. Tall, maybe 40, with the kind of calm that comes from having delivered bad news in small rooms like this one, enough times that it no longer shook her hands. Dr. Osi. She introduced herself, and then she asked me questions. Mila's age, her weight, whether she'd been around anyone sick, whether she'd had any unusual symptoms in the last few days. I answered everything. I was good at answering questions. I'd been a paralegal for 6 years at a firm on Elgin Street. Answering questions was the only useful thing I could still do in a crisis. Then she asked about family history. "Genetic conditions," she said, looking up from her tablet. "Immune disorders. Anything on either side we should know about." I knew what was coming before she finished the sentence. "I'd need to ask her father," I said. "Can you reach him?" I looked at the small figure of my daughter on the hospital bed, hooked to monitors, an IV already threaded into her tiny arm. Her cheeks were flushed. Her hair was damp at the temples. "I can try," I said. I hadn't spoken to him in 17 months. I'd deleted his number from my phone the day the divorce was finalized, standing on the Rideau Canal in February, with my phone in my hand, doing it the way you rip off a bandage. Fast, without thinking, before you can change your mind. His name was still in my email somewhere. His assistant number's name was probably findable. But what I needed was faster than that. I stepped into the hallway and called my former mother-in-law. We'd always gotten along, even at the end, even when everything was falling apart. She answered on the second ring, heard my voice, and didn't ask questions. Just read me the number. I stood in the fluorescent hallway with my back against the wall and stared at my phone for a long time. His name was Callum Ashford. He was 38 years old, and he ran the kind of company that doesn't advertise what it does. Private security consulting, government contracts, things I'd never been fully briefed on during our 4 years of marriage. He was the kind of man who made other men uncomfortable without trying. Controlled. Watchful. Dangerous in a way that was hard to explain to people who'd never been in the same room as him. He'd told me once, early in our marriage, when I'd asked him why he never talked about work. The less you know, the safer you are. I'd thought he was being dramatic. I'd thought a lot of things. I dialed. It rang 4 times. I was already composing what I would say to his voicemail when he picked up. Who is this? Not a question, a statement. His voice was exactly the same. Low, even. The kind of voice that doesn't rise at the end of sentences. It's me, I said. It's Sienna. Silence. The particular quality of silence that meant he was awake and alert and processing, the way he always processed. Quickly, completely, without letting anything show. Sienna. My name in his mouth felt like something I'd lost a long time ago. How did you get this number? Your mother. A pause. Why are you calling? I need your medical history. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Maybe the hospital had done something to me. Maybe spending an hour watching your daughter get hooked up to machines makes you very calm about everything else. Blood type, genetic conditions, immune disorders, anything inherited. I need it now. Why? I closed my eyes. Because our daughter is in the hospital. The silence that followed was different, total. The kind that happens between lightning and the sound that comes after. Our daughter, he said. Her name is Mila. She's 8 months old. She has a high fever and they're worried about a bacterial infection. And they need your family history before they can rule certain things out. You had a child. We had a child, I said. And I know you're angry and I know what this is. But right now I need the medical history. Everything else can wait. Another pause. Then, blood type O negative. No genetic disorders on record. My father had an autoimmune condition, psoriatic arthritis, diagnosed in his 50s, not hereditary as far as we know. Maternal side is clean. No immunodeficiencies. I exhaled. Okay. Thank you. Where are you? Cho. Ottawa. I'm in Toronto. A beat. I'll be there in 2 hours. You don't have to. I'll be there in 2 hours. He said it the way he said everything, without room for negotiation. Give the phone to the doctor. I found Dr. Osi in the hallway and handed her my phone. I watched her listen, watched her nod twice, watched her expression shift slightly from clinical concern to something more complicated. She ended the call and handed the phone back without looking at me. Oh, negative, she said. That's helpful. It matches Mila's blood type, which is consistent with paternity, and rules out a few things we were considering. We're going to run a full blood panel and start her on a broad-spectrum antibiotic as a precaution while we wait for cultures. She paused. Mr. Ashford mentioned he's en route with his family physician. His family physician. Of course. He has resources, I said. She looked at me steadily. I gathered. She let me sit with Mila for 20 minutes before they needed the room for a procedure. I held my daughter's hand through the crib rails. Her fingers wrapped around my index finger the way they had in the first hour of her life, automatic and trusting. I'm sorry, I thought. I didn't say it out loud. I'd been saying it in my head for 8 months every time I looked at her and saw his eyes. I'm sorry I thought I was protecting you. I'm sorry I didn't think it through. The waiting room was beige and bright and full of parents trying not to look at each other. I sat in a plastic chair with my damp jacket still on and my phone in my lap. Petra had texted 4 more times. I couldn't answer. What would I say? I called my ex-husband tonight for the first time in 17 months because our daughter nearly died and he didn't know she existed. Say that out loud. Try it. I called Petra's number by accident, pressing wrong while my hands were shaking. She picked up before I could hang up. Sienna. Finally. What's happening? Mila's in the hospital, I said. She's okay. I think she's okay. They're running tests. Oh God. Do you need me to come? I can come right now. No. I could hear my own voice going flat the way it did when I was trying not to cry. Stay. I called him. I called Callum. Petra went quiet. He didn't know, I said. He's coming. Sienna. I know. She sighed, that sound she'd been making since university that meant she loved me and also thought I was in over my head. Okay, I'm here. Call me when you know more. I sat with the beige walls and the hum of the overhead lights and the distant sound of a child crying in another room. I thought about the November I'd found out I was pregnant. 3 weeks after the divorce was final, standing in the bathroom of my new apartment in the Glebe, a positive test in one hand and absolutely nothing in the other. Callum had been clear about children. Not cruel about it. He was rarely cruel, but clear. Clear the way a closed door is clear. That's not a life I'm willing to build, he'd said, once when I'd tried to raise it. Not in my line of work. Not with the things I carry. I hadn't told him. I'd told myself it was the right decision. That I was protecting Mila from his world. From the men who called at strange hours. From the way he'd sometimes come home with new bruises and no explanation. I'd told myself she'd be safer without that shadow over her. I had not considered what would happen if someone found out about her anyway. The ER doors opened at 9:47 p.m. I heard him before I saw him. The particular quality of silence that preceded Callum in any room. The way ambient noise seemed to shift and settle around him like water around something solid. He came in with 2 other men flanking him at a discreet distance. He was wearing a dark jacket, no tie, his collar open. His dark hair was shorter than I remembered. The scar on his jaw, from something that had happened before we met, something he'd never fully explained, caught the fluorescent light. He saw me across the waiting room and stopped. I stood. For a moment, neither of us moved. He looked the way I'd imagined. He'd look in the version of this conversation I'd rehearsed 100 times in the last 8 months. Furious, controlled, somewhere beneath the control, something raw that I didn't have a name for. He crossed the room in 10 seconds. Where is she? He said. They have her in a room. Dr. Osi said she's stabilized. They think it might be a bacterial ear infection that progressed. She's on antibiotics. They're watching her temp. I want to speak to the doctor. Callum. I have a physician with me who's reviewed her chart remotely. I need 5 minutes with Dr. Osi. He paused, and something shifted behind his eyes. And then I need to see my daughter. The word landed differently than I expected. My daughter, not your daughter. Ours, claimed without hesitation, as if 8 months of absence hadn't happened, as if the only thing that had ever been missing was the information. Dr. Osi appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone who'd had powerful men arrive at her ER before and had a system for it. She shook Callum's hand, spoke to him and his physician quietly for several minutes, nodded at whatever his doctor said, made a note on her tablet. Then she led us both through the doors. Mila was asleep when we got to her room. The monitors beeped steadily. Someone had put a small stuffed bear on the edge of the crib. Not her elephant, not the one I'd brought, a hospital one. Her cheeks were still pink, but the fever had come down. She looked impossibly small. Callum stopped in the doorway. He stood there for a long time without moving. I watched him take in the crib, the monitors, the IV taped to her small arm. His jaw tightened. His hands, at his sides, went very still. Then he walked to the crib. He reached in carefully, slowly, the way you move around something breakable, and touched the back of her hand with 2 fingers. Mila didn't wake. Her fingers curled slightly, that automatic reaching reflex, and something happened to his face that I'd never seen before in 4 years of marriage. She has your nose, he said quietly. She has your hair, I said. He didn't answer. He stood there for a long time, his fingers still resting against her hand, and I stood back and gave him that, because it was the least I owed him. A nurse came in after 10 minutes and asked us gently to let Mila rest. We went back to the hallway. Callum's men had positioned themselves at each end of the corridor in a way that looked casual and wasn't. You should know, he said without looking at me, that I'm not leaving. I know. I mean tonight, and not tomorrow either. His voice was level. I need to think about what happens next. But tonight I'm staying until I know she's out of danger. The doctors say she'll be able to come home in a day, maybe 2. Good. He turned to look at me then, and the control was back, the full weight of it. Then we'll talk about what comes after that. Mila came home on day 2. Callum checked us out of the hospital himself. I hadn't asked him to. He simply did it, the way he did most things, with an efficiency that made it seem like he'd been planning it for a long time. He'd booked a room at the Fairmont on Rideau for the 2 nights, but he'd spent both nights in the hospital waiting room. I'd seen him there at 3 a.m. when I'd gone to get water, sitting in a chair with his jacket folded over his knee, awake. He followed us home. He stood in my apartment in the Glebe and looked around the way he looked at everything. Taking inventory, noting what wasn't there. The second-hand couch, the IKEA bookshelf with Mila's board books stacked beside my law texts. The baby monitor on the kitchen counter, a model from 3 years ago that I'd found at a garage sale in Westboro. The stack of mail I hadn't opened yet. The dry erase board on the fridge where I tracked Mila's feeds and temperatures because I kept forgetting things now. Sleep deprivation making my memory unreliable in a way that scared me. He didn't comment on any of it. I want to set up regular support, he said. Effective immediately, not a negotiation. She's my daughter, and I'm not watching you manage this alone. I don't need your money. That's a meaningless thing to say when you have a sick infant and a garage sale baby monitor and mail you can't find time to open. He said it without cruelty, which was almost worse. I'm not asking for credit. I'm correcting a situation I didn't know I was in. I sat on the second-hand couch and held Mila against my chest, her cheek warm and damp against my collarbone, her breathing finally easy. You told me you didn't want children. You said it clearly. You said. I said I didn't think I could keep them safe. He sat down across from me in the chair that wobbled slightly because one of the feet had cracked in the move, and I hadn't gotten around to fixing it. That's not the same thing. It felt like the same thing. I know. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. And you made a decision based on what you heard, which is understandable, and wrong, and something we're going to have to figure out how to get past. But right now I need to know she's going to be okay. He looked at Mila. At the back of her head, the dark hair stuck up in every direction. Is she always this small? She's on the big side for her age, actually. Something shifted in his expression. Almost amusement. Almost. Good, he said again. He came back the next morning. And the morning after that. He didn't announce it. Just showed up at 8, knocked twice, and stood at the door with 2 coffees from the independent place on Bank Street, and his jacket still on because he wasn't certain he'd be invited in. I let him in every time. He was careful with her in a way I hadn't anticipated. Gentle. Patient in a way he'd rarely been as a husband, though in fairness I'd never given him a reason to be patient. We'd fought loudly and loved loudly and come apart loudly. The kind of marriage that burns fast. But with Mila, he was different. He'd hold her on his forearm the way the nurse at court had showed him, support her head with his palm, talk to her in a low voice that I couldn't quite hear from the kitchen. Once I came around the corner and found him sitting on the floor with her, holding a board book open. Not a bear, the one she'd started wanting every night, reading it to her in the same even voice he used for everything. He looked up when I came in, didn't look embarrassed, just turned back to the book. I called Petra that evening and told her he was coming every day. And, she said, and I don't know. Do you want him to stop? I looked at the baby monitor on the kitchen counter, at the board book on the floor where he'd left it, at the coffee cup from this morning, still sitting in the drying rack, because I hadn't gotten around to putting it away. No, I said. Petra was quiet. Then figure out the rest. 3 weeks in, he told me why he'd said what he'd said about children. We were in the kitchen after Mila had gone down, the kind of quiet that settles over apartments when the baby finally sleeps and you're both too tired to move but too keyed up to sleep. He'd stayed late for the first time, though neither of us had acknowledged that he was staying. He was at the kitchen table with a glass of water and his phone face down in front of him, and I was standing at the counter with leftover pasta I wasn't hungry enough to eat. I had a colleague, he said without preamble, in my first year. His daughter was 6. Someone took her to get to him. He paused. They found her after 4 days. She was okay, physically. Another pause. He wasn't in the field after that. Couldn't be. Every decision he made, he was second-guessing what it might cost her. He turned the glass in his hands. I watched that happen and I thought, I can't do that. I can't be that kind of liability to someone I'm supposed to protect. I set down the pasta. You thought protecting people meant not having them. I thought that was the only logical conclusion. And now? He looked up. Now I have a daughter who is 8 months old, and I missed all of it. And she almost died before I knew her name. His voice stayed even, but something underneath it didn't. Now I think I was wrong about what protection looks like. I sat down across from him. The chair across from him wobbled. I'd fixed the one he usually sat in, but not the other. I was wrong too, I said, about what running away looked like. We sat there for a while without talking. Outside it had started to snow again. The fine, dry Ottawa snow that doesn't stick so much as accumulate, layering over everything gradually until you look up and the world has changed. I want to be here, he said finally. Not just visiting. I want to be part of this. What does that mean in practice? I'm in Ottawa more than I'm in Toronto. I've been maintaining the Toronto office as a base because there was nothing keeping me here. That's changed. He met my eyes. I'm not asking to move in. I'm not asking for anything more than you're comfortable with. But I want Mila to know me as her father, not as the man who comes on Saturdays. I thought about the version of this conversation I'd imagined having, the one where I was composed and clear and made all the right decisions. That version had evaporated pretty thoroughly at a hospital in a beige waiting room 3 weeks ago. Okay, I said. Okay? Ask me something specific. I'll tell you yes or no. He nodded. Can I come every day, for now until she's fully recovered? Yes. Can I set up the support through my lawyer? Direct deposit. Non-negotiable amount. I opened my mouth. Non-negotiable, he repeated. I closed it again. Fine. Can I take her to her 9-month checkup in December? Something about that question, the specificity of it, the 9-month checkup, the way he'd apparently already been tracking her appointments somehow, made my chest do something complicated. We can take her, I said, together. He held my gaze for a moment, then nodded once, the way he did when something was decided. Together. November turned to December the way it does in Ottawa, without ceremony, just a deepening of the cold and a darkening of the sky, the sun setting by 4 in the afternoon, so that every evening felt like the middle of the night. Callum came every day. He'd learned the rhythms of Mila's schedule, the way he learned everything, with total attention. And within a week, he knew that she woke at 6 on good days and 5:30 on bad ones, that she would eat the pureed sweet potato, but required coaxing for anything green. That the only thing that stopped her crying at 2 in the morning was being walked in a specific figure 8 pattern around the apartment. He'd figured out that figure 8 on his own at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday, while I was standing in the hallway half asleep watching him and not offering instructions, curious whether he'd find it. He found it in about 7 minutes. We were not together. We were careful not to be together. Careful in the way you are, when you're both aware of something neither of you has said. He stayed in the apartment later and later, and then one night he fell asleep in the chair that didn't wobble, with Mila on his chest, and I stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at them for a long time, and then very deliberately made up the couch with the spare blanket and went to bed. In the morning he'd left a note on the kitchen counter. Back at 8. Same writing as always. He'd always had neat handwriting, which had struck me as incongruous the first time I'd noticed it. I was still standing there looking at the note when Petra texted. She'd been asking careful questions for 3 weeks, the kind of questions that weren't really questions. How's Mila doing? Is he still coming by? How are you doing? With the you underlined in a way texts couldn't do, but somehow her messages conveyed anyway. I texted back. He fell asleep here last night. He was home before I woke up. He left a note. She responded. You're in trouble. I looked at the note. Back at 8. No punctuation, just a statement of intent. You have no idea, I wrote back. There was something I hadn't told Callum. Something I'd been not telling him for 3 weeks while he came every day and learned the figure 8 and fell asleep in the chair with our daughter. Something that sat in the back of my thoughts like a stone. 2 weeks before Mila's fever, I'd been contacted by a man. He'd found me through the firm, a voicemail, professional enough on the surface, asking about legal matters pertaining to my former husband's business interests. I hadn't called back. I'd deleted the message and not thought much of it. Clients sometimes made strange inquiries. It was a large firm with varied clientele. But the week after Mila came home from the hospital, another contact came. This time, a card slipped under my apartment door. No message. Just a phone number and 3 words. We know about Mila. I'd sat on my bathroom floor for 20 minutes after finding that card. I hadn't told Callum. I'd told myself I didn't have enough information. I'd told myself I needed to think. I'd told myself I was protecting him from unnecessary worry, which was, I recognized even as I thought it, exactly the same logic I'd used to justify not telling him about his daughter for 8 months. The card was still in the back of my desk drawer. I took it out on a Tuesday evening after Callum had left, sat at the kitchen table with it in front of me. Mila was asleep. The snow was falling in the orange streetlight outside the window. He had a right to know. I texted him, "Can you come over? Not tomorrow. Tonight." He was there in 22 minutes. I made tea while he read the card, watched him turn it over, set it down, pick it up again. His face was very still. "When did you find this?" 2 weeks ago. There was also a voicemail at the firm, before that. He set the card down on the table between us. "Why didn't you tell me immediately?" "Because I wasn't sure if Sienna." He said my name the way he said it when I'd done something he didn't agree with. Steady and without accusation, and somehow that was worse than anger. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I keep making the decision to manage things myself," I said. "And it keeps being the wrong decision. I know that. I'm telling you now." He looked at the card for another moment. Then he looked at me. "Are you finished managing things yourself?" "I'm working on it." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. He wasn't a man who smiled quickly. But a softening around the eyes. The particular expression he'd gotten sometimes during our marriage when I'd done something that surprised him. "Okay," he said. "Okay? I mean, I need to make some calls tonight, and in the morning I need to put some things in place, and we need to talk about a few changes to your routine. But, okay." "What kind of changes?" "The kind that are not negotiable." He reached across the table and picked up the card again. "Someone knows about Mila. That changes everything. I need to be closer." "How much closer?" He held my gaze. "That's what we need to talk about." We talked for a long time. Outside, the snow stopped and stopped again. At some point, I made more tea. And at some point after that, we moved from the kitchen to the living room, because my back hurt from the kitchen chairs. He talked to me the way he hadn't during our marriage. Directly, plainly, telling me things about his work, his world, the shape of the risks he carried, in enough detail that I understood what we were actually dealing with. I listened without interrupting, which was not something I did naturally, but which seemed to be what the moment required. "I have a property," he said. "In the Glebe, actually. 3 blocks from here. I bought it after the divorce. Don't ask me why. It made sense at the time." A pause. "It's fully secure. Better systems than this building. Guest suite, separate entrance. Mila would have her own room. You want us to move in with you. I want you to have the option." "I'm not." He stopped, seemed to choose the next words carefully. "I'm aware that asking you to restructure your life around my work and my risks is a significant thing to ask. I'm aware it's the thing you left, partly. I left because you wouldn't let me in," I said. "Not because of the risks." He was quiet. "I left because I felt like a visitor in my own marriage," I said. "I didn't know you. 4 years and I didn't actually know you. And I thought, maybe that's just who you are." I looked at the dark window, at the snow starting again, light against the glass. "But you're not that person with Mila. She's different." "I know. I'm saying that's something." The heating system kicked on, that click and hum of old Ottawa houses in winter. Mila made a small sound on the baby monitor, and then went quiet. "I know it's something," he said finally. "I don't know yet what it means for us. But I know I don't want to be 3 blocks away if someone is watching this apartment. Then don't be 3 blocks away." He looked at me. "Be clear about what you're saying." "I'm not saying we're back together," I said. "I'm saying Mila needs both of us in the same place right now. And I'm saying, I stopped, tried again. I'm saying I'd rather figure out what we are inside the same house than from separate addresses. If that's something you can do without it being." "Yes," he said. I wasn't finished. "Yes," he said again. "Whatever you were going to qualify, yes." We moved the following weekend. His property was, as described, 3 blocks away. A narrow Victorian semi-detached on a quiet street that backed onto a park, which was either a peaceful amenity or a security liability, depending on how you thought about these things. He'd had a security team go through it the day before. New locks, cameras I couldn't see but knew were there, a system I didn't understand and didn't need to. Mila took to the new place immediately. Babies are adaptable, I'd read that somewhere, though the books had also told me many things that turned out not to be true. She crawled through every room within the first hour. She'd started crawling 3 days before we moved, which meant she was now crawling everywhere with the focused energy of someone newly aware of how much of the world there is. Callum followed her around the living room at a low crouch, ready to intercept before she reached anything dangerous, and I stood in the kitchen doorway, watching them and thought, there it is, that's the thing. He could be so still in some moments and so entirely present in others. I told Petra about the move on the phone that night after Mila was asleep and Callum was in the study taking a call. She was quiet for a moment. Are you okay? She said. Not asked about the logistics. About me. I think so, I said. It doesn't feel like what I thought it would feel like. What did you think it would feel like? Like losing ground? I sat on the edge of the bed in the room that was technically mine. On the floor of the hall with the bathroom, and the room Mila's crib was in. His room was downstairs. We'd been very deliberate about that. It doesn't feel like losing ground. What does it feel like? I thought about the figure 8 at 2 a.m. About not a bear on the floor. About back at 8 in neat handwriting on the kitchen counter. About the way he'd said yes before I'd finished asking. Like starting something, I said. Or maybe finishing something that got interrupted. The threats, when they materialized properly, came on a Thursday. Callum told me about it the same night. Sat across from me at the kitchen table, the way he'd sat at my old kitchen table a month ago. But this time without the silence, without the measured weighing of what I could handle. He told me plainly. A group with connections to a former government client he'd worked against 3 years ago had made the moves. They'd found out about Mila through the hospital records, the paper trail of his name now attached to her file. There had been surveillance on our building in the glebe before we'd moved. The card under the door had been an introduction, a demonstration of capability. Now there were people working on them from the outside, and Callum had people working on the problem from the inside, and the space between those two things was currently our kitchen table. I need you to understand what this looks like for the next few weeks, he said. Tell me. He did. He told me what his people were doing, what he needed me to do or not do, what the risks were, and what he'd put in places against those risks. He answered my questions. All of them. Even the ones he clearly found difficult. When I asked him if we were in danger, he said, less than you were 3 days ago, more than I'd like. That was honest. I held on to it. 2 weeks later, the situation was contained. He told me that plainly, too, at the kitchen table, same as everything else. The people who'd made contact had been identified and dealt with through channels that he described briefly, and I chose not to ask follow-up questions about. His former client was no longer a factor. The surveillance was over. Is it over, I asked. Nothing is ever completely over, he said. But this specific thing, yes. Mila was on the kitchen floor between us, chewing on a teething ring, deeply uninterested in geopolitics. She'd gotten 2 bottom teeth in the last week and was working on a 3rd, which meant that everything was for chewing. Okay, I said. Okay, he agreed. We sat there for a while. Mila abandoned the teething ring and started pulling herself up on the cabinet door. She'd been trying to stand for 2 days, getting close, and then sitting back down in a controlled plop, frustrated and determined in equal measure. Callum watched her with his full attention. His hands rested loosely on the table. The scar on his jaw caught the afternoon light. Can I ask you something? I said. Yes. When did you stop thinking it was too late? He considered the question. When I saw her hand curl around my finger in the hospital. She didn't know me. She just reached. He paused. I'd spent a long time being convinced that people like me don't get to have things that curl toward us. I looked at him, at the profile I'd known for 5 years and was still learning. She's stubborn, I said. She doesn't ask for permission. I know. A pause. She gets it from somewhere. I was fairly sure he wasn't talking about me. Mila pulled herself upright against the cabinet door. Stood there for a second on unsteady legs, one hand gripping the handle, triumphant and wobbly, and completely unaware of what an enormous thing she'd just done. Then she looked across the room, at both of us, face splitting into the expression she got when she'd accomplished something and wanted witnesses, and let go. 3 steps. Then she sat down on the kitchen floor with a thump, looked at her own legs like they'd surprised her, and burst into delighted laughter. Callum crossed the room in 2 seconds and picked her up and held her against his chest, and she was still laughing. And I was already at the counter, writing it down in the notebook I kept for firsts. The date, the time, the 3 steps. And my handwriting was terrible, because my hands weren't entirely steady. First steps, I wrote. January 14th, kitchen, both of us there. Both of us there. That was the thing I would keep, I thought, even later, even when everything got complicated again the way things always do. Not the crisis or the fear or the long, uncertain weeks between. Not the card under the door or the hospital corridors, or the 17 months of managing everything alone. Just this. The kitchen in January, the snow outside, the sound of her laughing at her own legs, and both of us there.